Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Texas Immigration Law Council's podcast, Sidebar Immigration. I'm our host, Kristin Etter. We decided to create Sidebar because in the first month alone of the Trump administration, immigration policy and law has changed so much. We wanted to use this podcast as a way to explain the changes in the immigration landscape from the professionals in a way that is understandable and accessible. This limited series will provide insight into the evolving landscape of immigration. I'm back with Sidebar Immigration. Kristin Etter here, the Director of Policy and Legal Services. And today we are going to be talking about the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. I'm very honored and pleased to have our two guests today. We have Aaron Reichlin-Melnick. He's a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council and somebody who we internally at Texas ILC like to call the patron saint of immigration practitioners. He is the guru, and we are so pleased to discuss this case with today, to have on with us. We also have Bobby Painter. He is our managing attorney, one of our managing attorneys at Texas ILC. Thank you both for joining. I want to just start with you, Aaron, to give a brief kind of overview of the case. This case has really been called the loophole that would swallow the Constitution. So I want to talk about, just in the broadest way possible, why would this case swallow the Constitution? And why is it currently swallowing the Constitution as we speak?
Yeah, first off, thank you very much for having me. Always love the work that you guys are doing down there in Texas. So very happy to be able to support. So, of course, this is a case about at its core, a pretty basic thing. The government made a mistake and a judge has ordered them to fix their mistake. And set aside all of the debate about whether Mr. Abrego Garcia is a good father, a Maryland man, a terrorist, an MS-13 member, whatever you want to call him. At its core, that's what this is about. The government had an order in their hands that said the one place you may not deport Mr. Abrego Garcia to is El Salvador. And they did, by their own admission, through administrative error. They sent him to the one place it was illegal to send him to. And their way of fixing that is to do what they have done in many other cases, is to bring him back. However, they have decided that to bring him back would be to admit error. It would be to allow someone sent to CICOT to talk to the reporters and to explain what went through and to really show how shoddy this operation was. And so the White House has dug in and said, we're not going to do it. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I don't care what the lower courts say. We're not bringing him back.
And before we get into the Alien Enemies Act and the interplay with Mr. Abrego's case, I actually want to turn it to you, Bobby, because you've been a practicing immigration lawyer for more than a decade. And there's a very technical term that keeps on being used, which is withholding of removal. Can you take us back to Mr. Abrego's case? What is withholding of removal? When did he receive withholding of removal? And what does that actually mean?
Sure. And I think that's an important question because this is sort of a difficult type of immigration relief to explain, and some of the ambiguity around it has been what's allowed different actors to try to take control of the narrative and take it in different directions. So I'm going to try to do this in like a 30 to 60-second version, but we can ask follow-ups as needed. But essentially, withholding of removal is like your last-ditch humanitarian protection from deportation. In many ways, it's quite similar to asylum in the US in that the requirements are quite similar. You have to show that you fear persecution in your country of birth because of some protected characteristic and that your government can't or won't be able to protect you from that persecution. However, withholding is different in a number of specific ways. It's only for people who are currently facing deportation who wouldn't be eligible for asylum otherwise. And they might not be eligible because of criminal history, because they have a prior removal order, or for something more innocuous, like they just missed a deadline and didn't qualify for an exception. A few other really important differences to point out are that the burden of proof for somebody applying for withholding of removal is significantly higher than for somebody applying for asylum. Under our law, in order to be granted asylum, you need to show that there's a reasonable possibility that you would be persecuted. That's about a 1 in 10 chance, according to the Supreme Court. For withholding of removal, it's more likely than not. So it's a 51% chance. So what you have to really convince a judge that you will probably be harmed if you are sent back to your home country. And for that reason, if the judge makes that finding that you will probably be harmed, it is mandatory relief. There's nothing discretionary about withholding like there is with asylum. If a judge says you're going to be harmed, they have to grant withholding of removal. Having said that, though, there are fewer benefits. You don't get a path to citizenship, or you can't petition for family members. There's no green card in your future in most cases if you're granted withholding of removal. You're just kind of in a state of limbo for reasons that are kind of clear through the title of the relief. You are actually ordered removed by an immigration judge, and then that removal order is withheld because of the findings about the risks that you'll face in your home country. So in the case of Mr. Abrego, I believe he'd been in the country for quite some time before he actually found himself in deportation proceedings. I think he entered in around 2011 when he was still a minor, but he really only popped up on.
He was actually fleeing gang violence.
Correct.
In El Salvador, right?
That's
I mean,
right.
So that's like, that is so ironic and truly horrific about this, is he actually fled El Salvador because of gang violence in his home country.
That's exactly right.
So
it was sort of.
He came in as a minor, fleeing that violence, and then had been living his life here since 2011, did you say, with no
Yeah, it was 2011 and then.
convictions, married to a U.S. citizen, has U.S. citizen children.
Right. He was only actually encountered by immigration, I think, in 2019 when he was looking for work. He was a day laborer at a Home Depot, I believe, in Maryland, and he was picked up with a group of other people. And at that point, he was detained, denied bond, but he went through the entire process of proving up his withholding claim. And I'm not familiar intimately with the facts that he asserted, but he convinced an immigration judge, as I said, that it was probable, given what had happened to him and his family, that if he were sent back to El Salvador, that he would be harmed. And based on that, the judge went through this whole process that I mentioned, where they entered a removal order, but then withheld it because of the fear of persecution. And that was where he was released from detention, checking in with ICE periodically. One of the only things that you get when you get withholding of removal is a work permit. So he did have employment authorization for the first time afterwards, but continued to live his life as usual up until this March, when he was stopped by ICE and put on one of the flights to El Salvador.
And Aaron, can you talk a little bit? I mean, how is that possible? He had the protection of the immigration court. Bobby, you've called withholding of removal mega asylum, given the fact that it's such a higher burden to prove. And so what happened? What is the government saying? Why did they stop him? I think he was giving his child a ride home from daycare that day. Why was he stopped? And what are they saying happened to that withholding of removal?
He was stopped reportedly because they were trying to arrest him. I think this was a targeted arrest. ICE specifically intended to take him in. And the reason that they did is because they were arranging several flights to El Salvador on March 15th, where they wanted to send a number of people who had allegations of gang membership in whatever ICE database to El Salvador.
And I can ask you really quick, Aaron, because this is one thing. Didn't they initially, so Mr. Abrego is from El Salvador, not Venezuela, right? So the Alien Enemies Act, when it was first invoked late that night, I believe, or early that morning when they were trying to load up the planes, this was specifically for Tren de Aragua, not MS-13. So can you talk a little bit about that, and when was the MS-13 designation and the interplay of that as well?
Yeah, so MS-13 has not been designated under the Alien Enemies Act, and he was not deported under the Alien Enemies Act. So in total of the people that were sent to El Salvador on March 15th, about 238 people in total, about 137 of them, I believe is the number, were deported under the Alien Enemies Act. Everyone else, the 101 other people, were people who had final orders of removal previously issued, like Mr. Abrego Garcia. Of course, none of them had withholding of removal to El Salvador. He did. And so it's not clear why he was sent to Texas, especially because, according to the documents initially filed in the case, before this blew up as a massive political thing, everyone agreed that he shouldn't have been put on the plane. He probably shouldn't have even been there. But somewhere down the line, clearly a message went out to get as many gang members as they could, Salvadoran or Venezuelan, because they had a bunch of seats on a plane to fill. Now, we don't know exactly if that's what happened, but that does seem to be the most likely scenario given the chaos of the days leading up to it. Of course, he was detained 3 days earlier and was put on March 12th and was put on a plane by the 15th.
Right. You said they were trying to fill the planes with quote unquote gang members. What has been the evidence that the government has shown to this date prior to him getting on that plane? What was the evidence that the government claimed he was a gang member? And then what have they tried to do since then?
Yeah, well, I think I actually want to go back a second to, what of your first thing that you said was what have they showed about everyone who was on the plane? And it's really important to note nothing. They have offered no evidence about any of the people who were put on those planes that they were in gangs. Mr. Abrego Garcia is the only person that they have released any evidence on. And they've only done that after weeks of people saying, you need to back up your claims here. Everyone else on those planes, they've given no evidence whatsoever. And we know that a number of those people almost certainly were not gang members, including there's Andre Hernandez Romero, the gay makeup artist who was sent there seemingly because he had 2 tattoos that said mom and dad. You have Neri Alvarado, who was sent there with an autism awareness tattoo, where an ICE agent even specifically told him, no, we don't think you're in Tren de Aragua, and he nevertheless got sent there. And you have a lot of other similar cases like that. There's a guy, Jersey Reyes Barrio, who had a tattoo of a crown and a soccer ball. He is a professional soccer player, and that basically is the logo of Real Madrid. So a lot of these people seem to be sent there on pretty flimsy gang allegations. And then so when we look at Mr. Abrego, what you can see is flimsy gang allegations are not new. The original flimsy gang allegation in his case came up 6 years ago in March 2019 when he was arrested outside of a Home Depot in Maryland in a DC suburb. He was arrested for loitering. There were 3 other people there, and a police detective filled out what's known as a gang field interview sheet, which basically is a write-up of all the incident and to sort of show what they claim, all the gang connections of these people were. He says he didn't know any of the other people there. The gang field interview sheet says 3 out of the 4 people all were in MS-13. And he knows that for Mr. Abrego, allegedly because he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and a hoodie, an image that he suggests is coded for an MS-13, and because he was a confidential informant allegedly claimed that Mr. Abrego was part of an MS-13 clique. Now, of course, that is it. And that is pure hearsay. This is not something that would be admissible in criminal court. It is hearsay on hearsay. It is a document written by a detective who is testifying to what someone else told him about Mr. Abrego. So it is about as far away from hard evidence as you could think. And that's literally it before you get into the fact that the detective was actually suspended 2 weeks later for significant professional misconduct, selling police confidential information to a sex worker in exchange for sex, for which he was later prosecuted and pled guilty.
Yeah.
And that's literally it.
We talk about now in terms of the Supreme Court has essentially ordered that they facilitate his return. We have a 4th Court of Appeals opinion that I'm going to have you quote in just a second that came out late yesterday. But I want to talk to you, Bobby, about, is this something that it would be completely unheard of to bring somebody who's been erroneously removed back to the United States? I mean, this is something I've had a client when I was handling Operation Lone Star cases that got erroneously sent to Honduras. The government literally sent a plane, returned him. It was literally just a matter of filling out some paperwork. It was not a big deal. So talk a little bit about the ways that the US government and the mechanisms they have to facilitate returns of people who have been erroneously removed and why that's so important.
Sure. I mean, like you said, this isn't a completely unique situation. The government makes mistakes a lot. I've certainly seen, instances like this where ICE misinterprets the law, or the file is not labeled correctly, and all of us, I can imagine a number of situations where somebody with withholding of removal is caught up in an immigration enforcement action, and then before anybody catches the error, they're sent back to their home country. And you're right that there are mechanisms to bring those people back. I think it varies a bit from country to country, but usually it involves you need a court order, you need to figure out who the ICE liaison is at the embassy where that person was returned. You have to coordinate a flight, but there's a way to do this. What's unique in this situation is that Mr. Abrego wasn't just sent back to El Salvador, as most deportees are. He was sent back to El Salvador and immediately put into a maximum security prison, essentially like a legal black hole where nobody can get to him. But no, to your point, in the world of immigration law, this is not a completely unique situation.
I mean, it's essentially a matter of just filling out some paperwork, right?
Right. Right.
Especially when we're dealing with a country that we have such close diplomatic relationship with, as we do with El Salvador.
Right.
We had El Salvador's president just come visit. It was a very friendly visit. We have a contract with this government to house people. And so I think there's been an allegation that President Trump has said that requesting the return of Mr. Abrego would somehow violate El Salvador's sovereignty. Aaron, what do you make of that? We have a president who has prided himself on his negotiation abilities, especially as it relates to returning prisoners who have been put in foreign prisons.
Yeah, and going back to what Bobby said, the key distinction here between Mr. Abrego's case and the garden variety ICE messing up and someone coming back is that Mr. Abrego Garcia was sent to a maximum security prison, not because he had committed any crimes in El Salvador, but because the United States wanted him there. Of course, his detention, to be totally fair to the government, it's not entirely clear whether he is part of the deal to hold Venezuelans deported under the Alien Enemies Act or who had final orders of removal, because he is Salvadoran.
And they also haven't even given notice of what that contract is, what the terms are, right? I mean, I think
right.
There's been a lot of people that have tried to access that, and they have not released that. They've not been.
No, they have been completely secretive about this, in part because it's pretty obviously illegal. You just like taking a further step back here, the United States cannot pay another nation to imprison people who have not done anything. Just the idea of that is pretty inimical to American values of due process and the rule of law. These are people who have not committed any crime in the United States. Some of them have, a few of them have, but the vast majority of them have not. They have not committed any crime in El Salvador. They have not committed any crime in their home countries. They have not committed any crime anywhere. And yet we are literally paying to have them imprisoned, potentially for life. And no law in the United States permits that. So that being said, it's not clear if we are paying for Mr. Abrego Garcia, so that is the distinction here. But certainly, when it comes to what the courts can do and what it would be required to bring him back, it's very clear, as we recently saw, that Mr. Bukele, the president of El Salvador, controls Mr. Abrego Garcia's detention. And when he was in Washington, D.C. talking with President Trump could have easily just said to him, hey, I want you to release this guy. And so you have a very weird situation in the Oval Office where the White House was saying nothing we can do about it, and President Bukele was saying nothing I can do about it. And that's obviously not true. And I think they're sort of thumbing their noses at the rule of law there. But at the end of the day, it may be true, if El Salvador asserts total custody over him, that no federal court could obviously order the president of El Salvador to do anything. So this is why, in the case coming up right now, we're entering a period of expedited discovery. And one of that is going to be, let's find out the details of how he is being detained here and on what charges and under what agreements. Because if he is being constructively detained at U.S. request, then the United States can obviously ask to have him released. And I think that's something that will have to come out in the court case.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about some of the very conservative judges, most recently the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals judge, his opinion and some of the statements that he's made to the effect that you're saying. But also a couple days ago, the National Review, an ultra-conservative publication, recently demanded his release and said, quote, "This is an obvious injustice that could easily be remedied by bringing Abrego Garcia back. The administration maintains that this is impossible because it sent him to a foreign jail run by the government of El Salvador, not the United States. This is a ridiculous pretense because the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, will clearly do anything we ask. If the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America requested that he ride a unicycle wrapped in an American flag in San Salvador's Central Square, Bukele would probably ask whether it should be a Betsy Ross flag or the traditional stars and stripes. What do you make of that? When we have conservative publications, we have a conservative podcast host, Joe Rogan, calling this horrific. What do you make of this when we have 9-0 unanimous Supreme Court decision demanding that the United States facilitate his return, and the Fourth Court of Appeals, a very conservative judge yesterday? I mean, some of the quotes in that opinion, if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, I think this case is resonating with people because of the broader principles about a right to a day in court and the requirement to follow court orders, and because the Trump administration is openly flirting with sending people to El Salvador. You know, it's very easy to be caught up in the specifics of immigration and Salvadorans versus Venezuelans and Alien Enemies Act versus withholding of removal. But I think Judge Wilkinson, who is a very conservative Republican Reagan appointee on the Fourth Circuit, said yesterday, and he said he started his opinion with this, and this is in a decision denying the Trump administration's request to put a halt on Judge Sinis's order to do expedited discovery. What he wrote was, it's difficult in some cases to get to the very heart of the matter, but in this case, it is not hard at all. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Further, it claims in essence that because it has rid itself of custody, that there is nothing that can be done. This should be shocking, not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear. And at its core, it's just that. They're saying we can take anyone and send him to El Salvador, and once he's off the plane and in Bukele's custody, that's it. Game over. And that is a terrifying thought, because the obvious thing about that is that, well, if he can do it to Salvadorans, he can probably do it to U.S. citizens. And Judge Wilkinson touches on that as well later in his decision. He writes, the executive possesses enormous powers to prosecute and to deport, but with powers come restraints. If today the executive claims the right to deport without due process and in disregard of court orders, what assurance will there be tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens and then disclaim responsibility to bring them home? And what assurance shall there be that the executive will not train its broad discretionary powers upon political enemies? That is at its core why you see conservatives even stepping up and saying, this is simple. Even if the guy is a terrorist, an MS-13 member, every awful thing they've said about him, go through the right process. Give him his day in court that you are required to give him. Bring him back, put him through the process, and then deport him to any of the other countries you feel like it. Just don't send him to the one country it was illegal to send him to and then say we can't do anything about it.
Yeah. And I guess, Bobby, what does happen? Let's play this through, because I think we saw some official kind of postings on social media. We've seen people in the administration say he will never go back to Maryland. He's never coming back to the United States. What would they have to do? I mean, in terms of once you get this withholding of removal, is it a situation where they can bring him back and reopen the withholding of removal, or what would be the next steps?
Well, yeah, so let's assume that he is brought back to the US, and what would the next step be? So the statute governing withholding of removal makes it pretty clear, and the attending regulations make it pretty clear as well, that the only way to revoke that withholding order is for DHS through ICE to request that the immigration judge reopen that case to consider whether there had been enough factual changes on the ground in the country of birth of that person, where the 51% chance that they're going to be harmed is no longer there, effectively. And at that point, they can make the determination to say, okay, I'm no longer withholding the removal order is final. At that point, ICE has the authority to proceed with attempting to remove them to El Salvador. Now, other countries it's a bit more of an open question. So the statute governing withholding also does contemplate that people who are ordered removed could be deported to third countries, assuming that one, the country consents to that, and that there is no separate harm that the person being removed would face in that third country. Now, that situation historically has been pretty rare, where we've tried to send somebody to a third country. It's certainly a policy of this administration to expand the use of that authority, and we've seen them enter into agreements with any number of countries in Central America and elsewhere to accept deportees. But I think either today or yesterday, another federal court held that, okay, you have that authority, but you still have to give people a chance to assert a fear of harm in that third country as well. So they can't just do it arbitrarily. There needs to at least be a hearing about whether, let's say hypothetically, they try to remove Mr. Abrego to Honduras next. If he states that he's afraid of going to Honduras too, because the gang he fears has a presence in that country as well, he needs to have an evidentiary hearing about that fear before they can do it. The point of all of this is that there is a process contemplated within our statutes that the government could follow, but they're just choosing not to.
Yeah, I think in terms of there was that late breaking decision this afternoon. Is that right, Aaron? I think you had posted about it where they said, you have to tell the person, first of all, give them notice, which none of these 287 people had any notice. They were actually lied to and told that they were going back to Venezuela. So you actually have to give them notice, tell them where they're going, and then give them an opportunity. And I think that has been the trend that we're seeing across the country with various different judges, conservative, not conservative, is that you have to provide due process, right? So what does that look like? And where does this case go? Is it going back up to the Supreme Court? Where is it now, Aaron? And I guess if you had to look into your crystal ball, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so it's very hard to say what's going to happen with this case. And I don't want to speculate too much on it because this is something that has leapt beyond the bounds of the judicial system. And this is a political issue now. And it's a major political issue because, and in part because the White House really doesn't want to talk about tariffs and various other things that are going on right now. What we saw already is that Senator Chris Van Hollen went to El Salvador, and after multiple days failing to get in contact with Mr. Abrego Garcia, he did manage to convince the Salvadoran government to arrange a meeting. And at that meeting, Mr. Abrego Garcia was given civilian clothes and had a hat put on to disguise his shaved head that was forcibly shaved when he got there, which really shows that A, diplomatic pressure still works, and B, that I think Bukele was aware that he had to, at the very least, show that Mr. Abrego Garcia was still alive, because there was a lot of people were increasingly viewing El Salvador negatively. So this is something that is going to proceed on a diplomatic front as well as a legal front and a political front. And given those circumstances, I would be crazy to predict anything specific. What we do expect to see, however, more broadly, is this administration continuing to refuse to give an inch in court. The record of how they have been responsive to Judge Sinas's orders is minimal. They're basically flouting her orders left and right. Last week, she ordered them to provide daily updates on where Mr. Abrego was and what steps the government was taking to facilitate his return, what they had already done and what they were planning on doing. And so far, their response has been, we aren't doing anything because he's in Salvadoran custody. We're literally doing nothing. We have no plans to do anything. We haven't done anything, and we have no plans to do anything. So there is now going to be 2 weeks of depositions. The government may go back to the Supreme Court. Once people are under oath, they may reveal more, or they may sit there and stonewall and say a lot of I don't recalls and I can't tell you that, or that's classified, or it's a state secret, whatever it may be. I mean, this is basically full-blown intransigence from the federal government. And so how this is going to play out is really anyone's guess. But I think the one thing we do know is they're not backing down. Earlier today, as we record this podcast, the White House put out a pretty disgraceful edited version of a headline where they crossed out that was like, Senator meets with wrongfully deported man And they crossed off wrongfully because, of course, now they're not even admitting that he was wrongfully deported. They actually fired the DOJ attorney who initially made that concession. And what they said after they posted that was also, he's not coming back. So they are openly saying, we will not bring this guy back. And we're getting to the point where there will be an interbranch clash with the judiciary and the executive. Judge Wilkinson actually ended his decision yesterday with a plea for the government not to do that. The Trump administration, to change their mind. His final substantive paragraph, he said, "We yet cling to the hope that it is not naive to believe that our good brethren in the executive branch perceive the rule of law as vital to the American ethos. This case presents their unique chance to vindicate that value and to summon the best that is within us while there is still time." That is bleak for a federal circuit court judge, a conservative, to be pleading with a Republican White House to recognize the value of following the rule of law. And so I think we'll be following this case very closely. But as the Trump administration continues to make this about immigration, it's just so important to emphasize that this has gone far beyond being about immigration and is about these much broader forces going on in the country.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bobby.
I think that's exactly right. And irrespective of the outcome of this particular case, and looking past a lot of the really distasteful glee and revelry that the administration is exhibiting in talking about Mr. Abrego and the legal proceedings around it, I think there's something more sinister at work here. And the trend dates back well before the Trump administration, really to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, which is this gradual reframing of immigration issues as a national security issue as opposed to a justice issue or an economic issue, or however you want to frame it. And you'll notice that amidst all this rhetoric and the trolling that's going on, there's a very concerted effort by administration officials to create a lot of confusion around the terms terrorist and gang member and MS-13 and Tren de Aragua, and citing back to the executive orders calling some certain criminal organizations actual terrorist adversaries. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court and other courts give a great deal of deference to the executive branch in the realm of national security and in the realm of foreign policy. So by calling Mr. Abrego a terrorist, by saying that others who have been picked up off the streets and had their student visas revoked because they're working against the foreign policy interests of the US, is a power play. It's a way to take at least certain aspects of our immigration system outside of the scope of judicial review entirely. And for the reasons Aaron mentioned, that's a terrifying prospect, because if we just have to take any administration's word for it that somebody is a gang member, a terrorist, that's a really dark place.
Yeah, and not only that, but they want to expand. I mean, they're doubling, tripling, quadrupling down by saying they actually want to expand these deportations to homegrowns. So again, this is not just an immigration issue. This should terrify everybody. We are homegrown. There's just like this mix of people that could be very easily labeled a homegrown, right?
Well,
So what does a homegrown
Yeah.
mean?
I mean, yeah, and I think, again, we can't also take their wording on this. It's not deportation. You can't deport a U.S. citizen. By definition, you cannot deport a U.S. citizen. What it is banishment. What it is unconstitutional imprisonment overseas. I mean, which is actually, for those who are not up on every part of the Declaration of Independence, that's actually one of the specific claims in the Declaration of Independence. On the list of grievances against King George III is that specifically he has transported us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. So that was, King George was taking colonists in the 13 original colonies and bringing them over to the UK and trying them on fake charges and imprisoning them there. So here, he's not even suggesting there'd be trials. He's just saying we'd send them to be imprisoned in El Salvador. That's it. And I think that is a terrifying thought. That is literally why one of the reasons we founded the United States was to get away from stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fundamental to not just our system of governance and having a constitutional republic, but really about just being a human being in the world. and what it looks like when they can literally just strip you of your citizenship, of your personhood, of everything that you have in this country without a trial, without due process, and then say you have no recourse. So
Yeah.
I'm encouraged to see that so many people are paying attention and continuing to pay attention to this. And Aaron, I wanted to thank you so much for all of your amazing work that you do and all of your up-to-date information that you share with everybody and your analysis. And what can we do as people? What are some of the action steps that we can take? I mean, we're all three lawyers here, but non-lawyers, just everyday people that might be concerned about the direction that this is headed. What can you all say as we close that people can do?
I think publicly standing up for the rule of law is very important here and for a fair day in court and letting representatives, your representative, Democrat or Republican, hear that you believe in the rule of law, that we have these processes in place. We have a system of executive branch, judicial branch, legislative branch, and each branch is co-equal and each branch is required to follow the other branch's commands at times, even if they don't like them. That's always going to be the case. And we have to remind our legislators also that they have a role to play here. This doesn't have to be an interbranch fight alone between the executive versus the judicial. The legislative branch has a role to play. They could pass a law saying that this is not allowed. They could clarify things. They could defund this. They could conduct oversight. There's all these things the legislative branch could do that, of course, they're not doing. And of course, at the community level, it's standing up for the rule of law, standing up for your immigrant neighbors, making sure the government meets its burdens when it has to, and supporting local organizations that are helping people dealing with the climate of fear all of these actions create.
And beyond that, I can't overstate enough, and we talk about this a lot internally, just the power of narrative. And on one hand, it seems maybe too narrowly focused to talk at length about one specific individual caught up in this system. On the other hand, really understanding who Kilmar Abrego is makes it easier for you or me or anybody to put ourselves in his shoes and say, why not me? Why it very well could be me next. If we're talking about whisking people away without trial, who's to say I am a US citizen? Who's to say I'm not an MS-13 member? According to Sebastian Gorka, the president's counterterrorism advisor yesterday, we're all engaging in material support for terrorism right now simply by having this conversation. So the more we can build empathy and humanize people, as squishy as that sounds, it really does work to change the narratives and bring people out against some of these actions.
Yeah, and really quickly to sort of emphasize that as well, there's never going to be a perfect person that is the target of this. Of course,
Right.
the right wing is brought up. There are some things that Mr. Abrego did that are probably not the greatest, and they're not at all. He's accused of domestic violence. His wife stands by him. I'm not going to personally get involved in their marriage because she is certainly standing by his side now, but no one is perfect. But I think the broader picture here is as they dig through everything they can to smear this man, is to remember they didn't know any of this when they sent him there. They sent him there by mistake. They are now trying to retroactively paint him as some sort of horrifying criminal. And I don't think they've proven that. But even if they did, they didn't know that at the time. All of this is just post hoc rationalization. And while we talk about him, we also can't forget about all the other people that were sent there whose cases haven't yet been resolved. The Venezuelans, Andre Hernandez Romero, the gay makeup artist, who is still there, whose head was shaved as he sobbed in front of a Time photojournalist. There are so many people who are currently in El Salvador, hundreds of people whose cases we also can't forget if we just make it all about this one man. And really, when we talk narrative, the narrative here is no one deserves to be imprisoned in a foreign nation due to nothing that they did, nothing specific, no crime they committed, no judge ordered them there just because the government wanted a photo op and a headline.
Our system is there to protect angels and demons alike. And I've been doing this for 10 years, and I can tell you that there are no angels. We're all just people. And
yep.
That's the bottom.
Everyone's a human being and everyone has inalienable rights, and that's what our country was founded on.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. I wanted to thank you both so much. Aaron, we'll look forward to continuing to follow you as we look to these updates, and we'll just keep Mr. Abrego in our thoughts and his family and every single other person who's been wrongfully imprisoned in the Gulag of El Salvador in our thoughts. And I think ultimately the right thing is going to happen, and I look forward to welcoming him and the others that have been wrongfully removed back. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for having me.